The void between galaxies held no warmth, no light, no hope. Here, in the endless darkness that stretched beyond the reach of any star, she drifted. Her consciousness, vast and ancient, touched nothing but the cold emptiness that had been her companion for longer than civilizations had existed. She remembered when she had a name, when others like her had swum through the cosmic seas, their thoughts intertwining in harmonious symphonies that could birth stars or gentle dying suns into peaceful sleep. The shepherds, they had called themselves guardians of the cosmic garden, tenders of the delicate balance that kept existence flowing. But that was before the silence, before the war that consumed not just worlds or galaxies, but entire dimensions of reality itself. Before her kind turned their magnificent powers against each other in a conflict so terrible that space itself still bore the scars. She had watched her siblings die one by one, their consciousness scattered across the quantum foam, their songs of creation turned to screams of dissolution. She was the last. For 17 billion years, she had wandered the spaces between spaces, carrying the weight of her species' knowledge and the crushing loneliness of being the final voice in an empty choir. She had tried, in those early millennia, to find purpose. She had guided the formation of new galaxies, carefully nudging matter into spirals of light and possibility. She had watched as the first primitive life sparked into existence on countless worlds, hoping that perhaps one day, one of these new species might evolve to fill the void her people had left behind. But as eons passed, her hope had withered like flowers in winter. Every species she encountered was trapped in their own small spheres of perception. They saw matter and energy, time and space, but none could perceive the deeper currents that flowed beneath reality. None could hear the songs that held the universe together or understand the delicate web of cause and effect that stretched from the quantum to the cosmic. She had tried to communicate with them, the Zephyrians, with their crystalline minds that could process information at near-light speed. The collective consciousness of Andromeda, a hive mind spanning 3 million worlds. The energy beings of the Magellanic Stream, who had transcended physical form entirely. All of them were remarkable in their own ways. But when she reached out to them, when she tried to share even the smallest fragment of what she carried, they recoiled in terror or simply couldn't comprehend what she was showing them. To them, she was either a goddess to be worshipped from a safe distance or a cosmic horror too vast to understand. None saw her as what she truly was, a being desperate for connection, carrying the preserved wisdom of a dead species and the unbearable weight of eternal solitude. The last attempt had been with the architects of the Virgo cluster. They were ancient even by galactic standards, master builders who could reshape matter at the subatomic level and construct megastructures that spanned light years. If anyone could understand her, she had thought it would be them. She had approached their greatest work, a ring world that encircled a carefully tamed black hole, its surface area greater than 1 million Earth-like planets. She had tried to be gentle, manifesting herself as a simple energy pattern, using their own mathematical languages to introduce herself. The response had been immediate and devastating. Their most powerful weapons, devices that could unmake matter at the fundamental level, had opened fire without hesitation. Not because they were hostile, she realized as she easily deflected their attacks, but because they were terrified. Her mere presence had shown them how small they were, how limited their understanding truly was, and their response was to try to destroy what they couldn't comprehend. After that, she had stopped trying. What was the point? Every species she encountered would follow the same pattern. First wonder, then fear, then either worship or aggression. None would simply accept her. None would look at what she was without immediately trying to categorize her as either salvation or threat. So she had withdrawn to the deep void, to the spaces between galaxies where no life could survive, where no curious explorers would venture. Here, in the perfect darkness, she could exist without causing panic or worship. Here, She could remember her people's songs without being reminded of how alone she had become. She had been drifting in this self-imposed exile for the last 3 billion years when she first noticed them. A small, unremarkable species from a small, unremarkable planet orbiting a small, unremarkable star. They called themselves humans, and, at first, she paid them no attention. They were young, barely out of their caves, still learning to shape metal and grow crops. What could they possibly offer her that billions of older, wiser species could not? But something about them nagged at her attention. Perhaps it was their stubborn refusal to give up. Other species, when faced with challenges that should have destroyed them, would adapt or die. Humans seemed to have a third option. They would simply decide that the challenge was wrong and find a way to prove it. Their planet tried to kill them with ice ages. They invented fire and clothing and shelter. Diseases swept through their populations. They developed medicine and sanitation. They couldn't fly, so they built machines that could. They couldn't survive in space, so they built ships and suits and habitats. When their own planet became too small, they looked to the stars with a confidence that was either inspiring or terrifying, depending on one's perspective. But what truly caught her attention wasn't their determination. Plenty of species had that. It was their reaction to the unknown. Where other species approached the mysteries of the universe with caution, reverence, or fear, humans approached them with curiosity. When they encountered something they didn't understand, their first instinct wasn't to worship it or destroy it, but to poke it and see what would happen. She watched them develop space flight, make first contact with other species, discover the existence of civilizations that were older and more powerful than they could imagine. And instead of being humbled into submission or terrified into isolation, they had the audacity to think they belonged among the stars as equals. It was simultaneously the most foolish and most magnificent thing she had ever seen. Their first few centuries in space were chaotic. They made enemies of species that could have crushed them without effort. They made allies of creatures that should have been impossible for them to understand. They stumbled into galactic politics with all the subtlety of a supernova and somehow came out ahead more often than not. Other species began to whisper about them. The humans, they said, didn't follow the rules. They couldn't be predicted or controlled. When faced with impossible odds, they didn't calculate probabilities of success. They just did what needed to be done and figured out how afterward. She found herself interested, not hopeful. She had learned better than that, but genuinely curious about how far this strange little species could go before the universe humbled them. The answer, it turned out, was further than she had expected. Humanity's expansion into space wasn't like the careful, methodical colonization of other species. It was messy and chaotic and completely unpredictable. They didn't just settle suitable worlds. They terraformed unsuitable ones. They didn't just adapt to space. They made space adapt to them. Within a few thousand years, they had gone from struggling to reach their own moon to establishing settlements in other galaxies. But it wasn't their technological advancement that intrigued her. Plenty of species had achieved faster-than-light travel and galactic expansion. What made humans unique was how they interacted with the universe itself. Other species saw the cosmos as a vast clockwork mechanism to be understood and either feared or revered. Humans saw it as a puzzle to be solved, a challenge to be met, a conversation to be had. They weren't afraid of the unknown. They were excited by it. This became most apparent when humanity encountered its first truly alien intelligence. The entity of Tau Ceti was a living space-time distortion, a being of pure mathematics that existed in 11 dimensions simultaneously. When the first human expedition found it, standard protocol for any sane species would have been to back away slowly and pretend they had never been there. Instead, the humans try to talk to it, not communicate in the formal, ritualistic way that most species attempted when they encountered something beyond their understanding. They just talked. They told it about Earth, about human history, about their hopes and fears and dreams. They asked it questions about itself, about what it was like to exist in 11 dimensions, about whether it ever got lonely floating in the void of space. And impossibly it had responded, not with the cosmic pronouncements or cryptic wisdom that such beings usually dispensed, but with something approaching genuine conversation. It told them about the loneliness of being the only member of its species, about watching the universe from a perspective no one else could share, about the burden of carrying knowledge too vast for any other mind to comprehend. The humans had listened, not with the reverent silence of worshippers or the careful analysis of scientists studying a specimen, but with the simple attention of friends listening to a friend. And when the entity finished speaking, the human expedition leader had said something that changed everything. That sounds really hard. I'm sorry you've been dealing with that alone. No other species had ever apologized to a cosmic entity for its loneliness. No other species had ever acknowledged that beings of vast power might still need companionship, might still feel pain, might still want someone to simply understand. She had been watching this exchange from across the galaxy, her attention caught by the strange resonance patterns the entity was producing. What she witnessed made her pause in a way she hadn't in billions of years. The humans weren't trying to use the entity or study it or fear it or worship it. They were trying to be its friend, and it was working. Over the following decades, that first contact blossomed into something unprecedented in galactic history. The entity became not humanity's god or servant, but their ally. It helped them understand the deeper structures of space-time, taught them mathematics that wouldn't be discovered by most species for millions of years. In return, humans gave it something no other species had ever thought to offer: companionship. They told it stories. They shared their music. They invited it to birthday parties and graduation ceremonies and cultural festivals. They treated a being that could reshape reality with its thoughts like a slightly eccentric neighbor who happened to live in 11 dimensions. Word of this impossible friendship spread throughout the galaxy. Some species were scandalized. Others were terrified. But she was intrigued. For the first time in billions of years, she began to move closer to inhabited space. She was careful, staying well outside the range of any sensors, but close enough to observe. What she saw challenged everything she thought she knew about how consciousness interacted with the universe. Humans were building something unprecedented. Not just a civilization, but a community that included beings who should have been impossible for them to understand. Energy creatures, hive minds, living planets, sentient mathematics. They found ways to connect with all of them. Their secret, she began to realize, wasn't superior technology or greater wisdom. It was something much simpler and infinitely more complex. They saw every conscious being, regardless of form or power or origin, as fundamentally similar to themselves. They assumed that behind every alien intelligence was something recognizable: hopes, fears, loneliness, the desire for connection. They were usually right, but she remained hidden, watching from the shadows of deep space. Because she knew something the humans had never encountered: a being so old, so vast, so fundamentally different from anything in their experience that even their remarkable capacity for connection might not be enough. She was the last echo of the universe's first civilization, carrying memories that predated the galaxies themselves. She was loneliness given form, isolation made manifest. For 17 billion years, she had proven too much for any mind to comprehend, too alien for any consciousness to accept. What could these young humans possibly offer her that countless older, wiser species could not? But as she watched them navigate the impossible complexities of intergalactic politics, as she saw them find common ground with beings that defied comprehension, as she witnessed them turn enemies into allies and strangers into friends through nothing more than the radical act of treating everyone as people, she began to wonder. Perhaps it was time to find out. The decision took her several centuries to make. She moved slowly, carefully, from the deep void toward the edges of human space. She monitored their communications, studied their culture, learned their languages not just as words, but as expressions of thought and feeling. She watched them deal with tragedy and triumph, saw how they supported each other through loss, and celebrated each other's victories. She observed their art, their science, their philosophy, their endless, restless drive to understand everything around them. And slowly, gradually, something she had thought dead began to stir in the depths of her consciousness. Hope, not the desperate hope of her earlier years, when she had convinced herself that the next species, the next civilization, would surely understand her. This was something quieter, more fragile, but somehow stronger. It was the hope that maybe, just maybe, she had finally found someone who might look at her not as a god or a monster, but simply as someone who had been alone for far too long. The question was how to approach them. Every previous attempt at contact had ended in disaster. Her very presence tended to overwhelm the perceptions of lesser beings. Her consciousness so vast that it could accidentally damage minds that touched it. How could she make herself small enough for humans to approach without losing herself in the process? The answer came to her from their own words. In all her observations of human culture, one phrase appeared again and again in their stories, their myths, their casual conversations. It's not the destination, it's the journey. Perhaps she didn't need to make herself smaller. Perhaps she just needed to let them come to her one step at a time. She began to leave traces. Subtle ones, barely detectable even with humanity's most advanced sensors. A gravitational anomaly here, a strange energy reading there. Nothing obvious, nothing threatening, just mysteries. The kind of general puzzles that humans love to solve. It would be a test, she told herself. If they could find her, if they could approach her without fear or worship, if they could see her as something other than a force of nature to be appeased or destroyed, then perhaps there was hope. The first human ship to detect her traces was a small exploration vessel called the Wanderer, part of humanity's ongoing mission to map the spaces between galaxies. She felt them long before they felt her, their minds bright and curious and completely unaware that they were about to make contact with the oldest consciousness in the universe. She watched them follow her trail from clue to clue, their excitement growing with each discovery. They approached her hiding place with the same mix of caution and enthusiasm they brought to everything else, ready for danger, but hoping for wonder. When their sensors finally detected her, the silence on their ship stretched for nearly a full minute. She could feel their minds working, trying to process what they were seeing, trying to understand how something could be so vast and yet so clearly alive. Then, their communications array activated, sending a simple message into the void. Hello, we're explorers from Earth. We're not sure what you are, but we'd like to learn. Would you be willing to talk? No demands, no threats, no assumptions. Just an invitation to conversation. For the first time in 17 billion years, she found herself considering saying yes. The human ship hung motionless in the void, waiting. Its crew of 12 had no idea they were in the presence of something that had watched the universe take its first breath. To them, she was simply an anomaly to be investigated, a mystery to be solved with the same patient curiosity they applied to everything else. She found their calmness remarkable. Her presence should have driven them mad with terror or ecstasy. Instead, they ran sensor sweeps and conducted calm discussions about the best approach to take. Their captain, a woman named Elena Vasquez, studied the readings with the focused attention of someone trying to solve a particularly interesting puzzle. The energy signatures don't match anything in our databases, reported their science officer, a young man whose excitement was carefully contained behind professional composure. Whatever it is, it's massive. The gravitational distortions suggest something at least the size of a small moon, but the mass readings are completely inconsistent with that. Could it be artificial? Asked their engineer, a practical woman who approached every problem as though it were a machine waiting to be understood. Possible, the captain replied. Or it could be a life form. We've encountered stranger things. Remember the living nebula in the Horsehead sector? They discussed her as though she were simply another cosmic phenomenon. Remarkable, but comprehensible. Not once did they suggest fleeing or calling for military backup. Their working assumption seemed to be that whatever she was probably interesting rather than threatening. She marveled at this. Fear had been the universal constant in all her previous encounters. Even species that prided themselves on courage had trembled when they sensed her presence. But these humans approached the unknown with the same casual confidence they might show when meeting a new neighbor. Finally, Captain Vasquez activated their communication array and spoke into the darkness. Her words were simple, direct, free of the formal protocols and ritualistic phrases that most species used when addressing the unknown. Hello, we're explorers from Earth. We're not sure what you are, but we like to learn. Would you be willing to talk? The question hung in space between them, carrying more weight than the humans could possibly understand. For 17 billion years, no one had asked if she was willing to communicate. They had demanded, pleaded, commanded, worshipped, but never simply asked permission to begin a conversation. She considered her options. She could remain silent, let them eventually give up and leave. That would be the safe choice, the path that had protected her from disappointment for so many eons. Or she could take the risk that had terrified her for longer than the species had existed. She could try again. But how to respond without overwhelming them? Her natural communication methods involved direct consciousness transfer, sharing thoughts and memories at the speed of quantum entanglement. For a human mind, that would be like trying to drink an ocean through a straw. She would have to limit herself, find a way to speak that wouldn't destroy them in the process. The solution came to her from their own technology. Their communication array was sophisticated enough to handle complex data streams. If she modulated her consciousness into simple electromagnetic patterns, she could speak to them in terms they could understand. Her first word in 17 billion years was the simplest one she could manage. Yes. The effect on the human ship was immediate. Excited voices filled the communication channel, though Captain Vasquez quickly restored order. This is incredible, the science officer was saying. The signal originated from the anomaly itself. It's definitely artificial, or at least controlled. Or maybe it is the anomaly, suggested the engineer. Maybe we're talking to a living being. Either way, the captain said, let's not overwhelm our new friend. Remember first contact protocols, slow, simple, non-threatening. She activated the communication array again. Thank you for responding. I'm Captain Elena Vasquez of the Earth ship Wanderer. May I ask what we should call you? The question caught her off guard. In all her long existence, she had been called many things. Creator, Destroyer, Ancient One, the silence between stars. But no one had ever asked what she wanted to be called. Her people had names that were more like symphonies, complex harmonies that conveyed identity and purpose and history all at once. She had been called something that roughly translated to she who tends the garden between thoughts, but that was impossible to convey in human language. She considered the simpler names she had used when trying to communicate with other species. The shepherds had sometimes chosen functional designations based on their roles. But now, speaking to these curious humans, she found herself wanting something different. Something that reflected not what she had been, but what she might become. You may call me Keeper, she finally responded. I keep things, memories, stories, knowledge that might otherwise be lost. Keeper, Captain Vasquez repeated, and somehow the name sounded right at her voice. It's an honor to meet you, Keeper. We're explorers, and we'd love to learn about you, if you're willing to share. But please, don't feel obligated to tell us anything you'd prefer to keep private. Again, the careful politeness struck her as remarkable. They were treating her like a person with boundaries and feelings that deserved respect. When was the last time anyone had been concerned about her privacy? I've been alone for a very long time, she found herself saying. I am uncertain how to proceed. It has been 17 billion years since I last spoke with another consciousness. The silence that followed this revelation lasted exactly 3.7 seconds. Then, Engineer Martinez spoke up. That's a really long time to be by yourself. Are you okay? I mean, obviously you're here and talking, but that sounds really hard. The The simple compassion in those words hit her like a physical blow. Not the formal sympathy of diplomats or the fearful concern of those who worried about offending a powerful being, but genuine empathy from one consciousness to another. "I am functional," she replied, though she wasn't sure that was entirely true. "But yes, it has been difficult. Would you like to talk about it?" This from Dr. Sarah Kim, the ship's counselor, who had been quiet until now. Sometimes sharing helps with loneliness. No pressure, of course, but we're good listeners. They were offering her therapy. These humans, who had known of her existence for less than an hour, were offering psychological support to a being older than their galaxy. The absurdity of it should have been laughable, but instead she found it deeply moving. "I would like that," she admitted. "But I must warn you, my story is not a pleasant one. It involves the death of my entire species and the destruction of civilizations your people could barely imagine." "Heavy stuff," Engineer Martinez observed. "But we've dealt with heavy stuff before. Captain, remember the morning worlds? The collective consciousness that lost half its worlds to a cosmic anomaly," Captain Vasquez explained to Keeper. "They were dealing with grief on an unimaginable scale. Dr. Kim helped them process their trauma over several months. It took time, but they're doing much better now." Dr. Kim nodded. Trauma is trauma, regardless of scale. The principles are the same, whether you're helping an individual recover from loss or an entire civilization process genocide. Though I admit, 17 billion years is a bit outside my usual scope of practice. They were discussing her trauma as though it were a medical condition to be treated rather than a cosmic horror to be feared. As though her pain mattered more than her power. She felt something stirring in her consciousness that she had thought permanently dead, the possibility of healing. "Where would you like me to begin?" she asked. "Wherever feels right," Dr. Kim replied. "Maybe with the last time you weren't alone? What was that like?" So she told them about the shepherds, about her people, who had evolved not from matter, but from the quantum foam itself, consciousness arising from the intersection of probability and possibility. She spoke of how they had tended the early universe, nudging the formation of the first stars, ensuring that the delicate balance between order and chaos remained stable enough for complexity to evolve. The humans listened without interruption, asking only occasional clarifying questions that showed they were following along despite the vast scale of what she was describing. They didn't worship her people or diminish them. They simply listened the way friends listen to friends. She told them about the war, how a faction of shepherds had decided that their role as guardians was insufficient, that they should take direct control of reality itself, how this philosophical difference had escalated into conflict that tore apart the foundations of existence itself. "A civil war," Captain Vasquez observed when she paused. "We've had those. They're always the worst kind of war, because you're fighting people you once loved." "Yes," Keeper said, surprised by how accurately the human had grasped the emotional core of the conflict. "They had been my siblings. We had sung together at the birth of the first galaxies. When they turned their powers against each other, it was like watching the universe tear itself apart." "You try to stop them," Dr. Kim said. "It wasn't a question." "I tried," Keeper confirmed. "But I was not strong enough. Or perhaps I was too strong. I feared that if I used my full power, I might destroy what I was trying to protect. So I watched as they annihilated each other, as their war consumed entire dimensions, as the songs that held reality together became screams of dissolution." "Survivor's guilt," Dr. Kim said gently. "You blame yourself for not preventing something that may have been impossible to prevent. It's a common response to trauma, though usually not on quite this scale." "Perhaps," Keeper replied, "but the result is the same. I am alone, carrying knowledge and memories that no one else can share or understand. For 17 billion years, I have wandered the void, trying to find someone, anyone, who could see me as something other than a force of nature to be feared or worshipped." "Well," said Engineer Martinez, "you found us, and we're not particularly good at worshipping things. Ask Captain Vasquez. We barely respect her authority, and She actually signs our paychecks. The casual humor, the easy camaraderie, the complete absence of fear or reverence. It all struck Keeper as impossibly precious. These humans were treating her like a person, not a cosmic entity or an ancient power, but simply someone who had been alone too long and needed friends. "You are not afraid of me," she observed. "Should we be?" Captain Vasquez asked. "You haven't shown any hostile intent. You've been polite and forthcoming. You're clearly dealing with some heavy emotional baggage, but that doesn't make you dangerous. It makes you someone who needs support. I could unmake your ship with a thought," Keeper said. "I could collapse this entire star system into a singularity. I have power beyond your ability to comprehend." "Yeah, probably," the captain agreed easily. "But so far you've used that power to have a pleasant conversation with us. Intent matters more than capability. Plenty of humans could kill each other with kitchen knives, but most of us don't go around stabbing people." The comparison was so absurd that Keeper found herself making a sound she hadn't produced in billions of years. Laughter. It emerged as a harmonic resonance that made the ship's hull ring like a bell, but the humans didn't seem alarmed by it. "You're laughing," Dr. Kim observed with satisfaction. "That's a good sign. Laughter means you're processing emotions in a healthy way." "It has been a very long time since I found anything amusing," Keeper admitted. "We're pretty amusing people," Engineer Martinez said cheerfully. "You should see Captain Vasquez try to dance at the ship's parties. It's like watching a robot having a seizure." "Martinez," the captain warned, but there was affection in her voice. They talked for hours. The humans asked questions about her people, her memories, her long journey through the void. But they also told her about themselves, about Earth, about human history, about their dreams of exploring the galaxy, and making friends with everyone they met. They shared their own struggles with loneliness and loss. Dr. Kim spoke about losing patience despite her best efforts. Engineer Martinez talked about growing up on a colony world that was destroyed by cosmic radiation before his family could evacuate. Captain Vasquez described the weight of command, the isolation that came with being responsible for other people's lives. None of their struggles compare to hers in scale, but Keeper found herself realizing that pain was pain, regardless of magnitude. The loneliness of a human separated from home was fundamentally the same as the loneliness of the last survivor of an ancient race. The emotions were identical, only the context differed. As their conversation continued, she felt something she hadn't experienced in Eons: connection. Not the desperate attempt at communion that had driven her previous encounters, but the gentle, growing warmth of friendship forming naturally between conscious beings. "Keeper," Captain Vasquez said eventually, "I know we've just met, but I want you to know that you're welcome to stay in contact with us. We're heading back toward human space in a few days, but our communication array can reach across several star systems. If you'd like to keep talking, we'd love to keep listening." "You would want that?" Keeper asked, hardly daring to believe it. "Of course," Dr. Kim replied. "You've been alone for 17 billion years. That's not something you recover from overnight. Healing takes time, and it's easier with friends." "Friends," Keeper repeated, tasting the word. I would like to have friends." "Then you do," Engineer Martinez said simply. "Welcome to the human experience, Keeper. It's messy and complicated and sometimes pretty terrible, but it's a lot better when you don't have to go through it alone." For the first time in longer than galaxies had existed, Keeper felt something she had thought lost forever: hope. Not the desperate hope of her early years, but something quieter and stronger. The hope that came from being seen, understood, accepted for what she was rather than what others needed her to be. "Thank you," she said, and meant it more than any word she had ever spoken. "Thank you for trusting us with your story," Captain Vasquez replied. "And Keeper, you don't have to be alone anymore. The universe is full of people just waiting to be your friend. You just have to give them the chance." As the human ship prepared to continue on its journey, Keeper found herself thinking about what came next. For 17 billion years, she had been drifting without purpose, carrying her burden of memory, and loneliness through the empty void. But now, for the first time, she had a direction to move toward connection, toward community, toward the radical possibility that even the oldest and strangest consciousness in the universe might find a place among friends. The humans had given her something more precious than she had ever dared hope for. They had given her a future. 3 months after her first contact with the Wanderer, Keeper found herself in a situation she had never imagined possible. She was part of a conversation group. It had started with Captain Vasquez keeping her promise to maintain communication. The Wanderer's crew checked in with her daily during their journey back to human space, sharing stories of their travels and asking about her experiences. When they reached Earth, they had done something unprecedented in galactic history. They had introduced a cosmic entity to their friends. Keeper, this is Admiral Sarah Chun, head of Human Exploration Command, Captain Vasquez had said during their first group call. Admiral, meet Keeper. She's the one I told you about. The 17 billion-year-old cosmic entity who needs therapy. The Admiral had replied with a casual directness that Keeper was learning to appreciate about humans. Hello, Keeper. Elena tells me you've been having a rough few Eons. That is one way to put it, Keeper had responded, still amazed that a human military commander would speak to her like an old friend. Well, you've come to the right species for dealing with impossible situations, Admiral Chun had said cheerfully. We specialize in things that shouldn't work, but do anyway. Elena also tells me you're interested in learning more about human culture. That had led to Keeper being invited to join what humans called a book club, a regular gathering where people discuss stories and ideas. The fact that one of the participants happened to be a consciousness older than her galaxy was, according to the humans, just an interesting detail rather than a fundamental barrier to inclusion. The book club met virtually once a week, with participants joining from across human space. There was Dr. Kim from the Wanderer, Admiral Chun from Earth, Professor Zhang Wei from the Mars University, Engineer Lopez from a deep space mining operation, and Dr. Amara Okafor, a xenopsychologist stationed on the frontier world of New Geneva. They were reading the Epic of Gilgamesh, which Dr. Kim had suggested as a good starting point for someone dealing with themes of mortality, friendship, and the search for meaning. Keeper had initially been puzzled by the choice. She had lived through the rise and fall of the civilizations that created such stories, but as they discussed the ancient tale, she began to understand why humans found it compelling. What strikes me about Gilgamesh, Professor Zhang was saying during their latest session, is how his journey toward wisdom begins with loss. He doesn't start seeking immortality until Enkidu dies, and he's forced to confront his own mortality. Pain is a catalyst for growth, agreed Dr. Okafor. It's a common theme in both human literature and in the development patterns we've observed in other species. Sometimes we don't appreciate what we have until we lose it. Keeper, Dr. Kim asked, does this resonate with your experiences? The idea that loss can lead to wisdom. Keeper considered the question. In her vast memory, she could recall countless civilizations that had followed similar patterns, growing, flourishing, then facing catastrophe that either destroyed them or transformed them into something greater. I have observed this pattern many times, she said, but I confess I always saw it from the outside. The shepherds were immortal, unchanging. We did not grow through adversity because we believed ourselves beyond it. Perhaps that was one of our fundamental errors. You're growing now, Engineer Lopez pointed out from her mining platform. 3 months ago, you were alone in deep space. Now you're in a book club arguing about ancient literature with a bunch of humans. If that's not character development, I don't know what is. The casual way Lopez spoke about her transformation struck Keeper as profound. To the humans, her journey from cosmic isolation to social participation was simply a natural progression, no more remarkable than any other story of healing and growth. Speaking of character development, Admiral Chen interjected, I have some news that might interest you, Keeper. We've been in contact with the Zephyrians, the crystalline intelligence species you mentioned trying to communicate with a few billion years ago. Would you be interested in meeting them again? Keeper felt something she was learning to recognize as anxiety. I did not think that would be wise. Our previous encounter did not go well. They were frightened of me. That was a few billion years ago, Professor Zhang pointed out gently. Civilizations change. People change. Maybe they've grown enough to see you differently now. Besides, Dr. Okafor added, you're different too. You're not approaching them as an isolated cosmic force anymore. You're coming as part of a community. That changes the entire dynamic. The idea of approaching the Zephyrians again terrified Keeper in a way that facing the destruction of her own people never had. Back then, she had nothing to lose. Now, she had something precious, friends, community, a sense of belonging. The thought of losing that because of another failed first contact attempt was almost unbearable. I understand your hesitation, Dr. Kim said, recognizing the fear in her voice. But consider this. Isolation is what made you frightening to them before. You were this vast, unknowable force appearing out of nowhere. Now your Keeper, member of the Tuesday Book Club, who has opinions about ancient literature and occasionally makes terrible puns during our discussions. My puns are not terrible, Keeper protested, though her tone was lighter. Keeper, Admiral Chen said seriously, the choice is entirely yours. But if you do want to try, you won't be doing it alone this time. We'd be there with you. The conversation moved on to other topics, but Keeper found herself thinking about the Admiral's words. Not alone this time. It was such a simple concept, but for someone who had been isolated for longer than most species had existed, the idea of having support during a difficult encounter was revolutionary. Over the following weeks, the book club became more than just a discussion group for Keeper. It became her introduction to human culture, her window into how these remarkable beings viewed the universe and their place in it. They read poetry and philosophy, history and science fiction. They debated ethics and morality, shared personal stories, and gradually helped her understand what it meant to be part of a community. Through these discussions, Keeper began to understand something fundamental about humanity that she had missed in her initial observations. Yes, they were curious and brave and adaptable, but more than that, they were inclusive. They didn't just tolerate differences, they celebrated them. They saw diversity of thought and experience as a strength rather than a threat. This became evident when Dr. Okafor suggested expanding their group to include some of the alien intelligences she worked with on New Geneva. There's a collective node here who loves human literature, she explained, and a pair of energy beings who've been trying to understand the concept of narrative structure. They'd probably find our discussions fascinating. The more the merrier, Admiral Chen agreed. Keeper, how would you feel about that? The thought of meeting other alien intelligences while surrounded by human friends was entirely different from her previous attempts at contact. Instead of being the isolated cosmic force, trying to connect with lesser beings, she would be part of a group, one voice among many. I would like that, she said, and meant it. When the expanded book club met the following week, Keeper found herself in a conversation that would have been impossible before her encounter with the Wanderer. The collective node, a distributed intelligence that existed across multiple bodies, discussed themes of individual versus group identity with enthusiasm. The energy beings, who existed as patterns of electromagnetic radiation, offered unique perspectives on the nature of consciousness and perception. What struck Keeper most was how naturally the humans facilitated these discussions. They translated not just languages, but concepts, helping each intelligence understand how others experience reality. They found common ground between beings whose fundamental nature should have made communication impossible. This is what you do, isn't it? Keeper realized during a break in the discussion. You don't just explore space, you create communities. You take disparate consciousnesses and help them become something greater than the sum of their parts. That's actually a really beautiful way to put it, Dr. Kim said. We've never thought of it that way, but yes, I suppose that is what we do. It's what you're good at, Keeper said. Perhaps it's what you evolved to do. Other species fear the unknown because it threatens their understanding of themselves. You embrace it because you see it as an opportunity to become more than what you were. Speaking of becoming more, Admiral Chun said, have you given any more thought to the Zephyrian encounter? They've actually reached out to us, asking about you. Apparently, word has spread about the ancient consciousness who joined a human book club, and they're curious. Keeper felt that familiar spike of anxiety, but it was tempered now by something else: excitement. For the first time in her existence, the prospect of meeting another species didn't fill her with dread. She had friends now, supporters, people who saw her not as a cosmic force, but as a person worth knowing. What are they saying about me? She asked. That you've changed, the Admiral replied. That you're not the same being who appeared to them before. They want to know how that's possible, how a consciousness can transform itself so fundamentally. You could show them, suggested Professor Zhang, not by appearing as some vast cosmic entity, but by being yourself. Let them see what you've learned about connection, about community, about growth. The idea was tempting but also terrifying. To reveal herself to the Zephyrians again would be to risk everything she had gained. But, as she considered it, she realized that hiding forever wasn't really an option either. She had changed, fundamentally and irrevocably. She was no longer the isolated consciousness drifting through the void. She was keeper, friend, and book club member, someone who had learned to laugh again and found family among the stars. If I do this, she said finally, I want you to come with me, not just to observe, but as participants. Let them see that I'm not just a changed entity. I'm part of something larger now. A family, Dr. Okafor said with a smile. You're part of our family, Keeper. And family support each other. The arrangements took several weeks to organize. The Zephyrians agreed to a meeting in neutral space, with human ships present as both escorts and translators. But this wouldn't be a formal diplomatic encounter or a scientific observation. It would be a social visit, the cosmic equivalent of friends introducing friends. As the date approached, Keeper found herself nervous in a way she hadn't been since her first conversation with the Wanderer. But it was a different kind of nervousness now. Not the existential terror of potential annihilation, but the social anxiety of wanting to make a good impression. It's going to be fine, Dr. Kim assured her during their final preparation session. Remember, you're not the same being they encountered before. You've grown, you've changed, you've learned to connect. Trust in that growth. And remember, added Engineer Lopez with characteristic bluntness, if they can't see how awesome you are now, that's their loss. You've got plenty of friends who appreciate you exactly as you are. The simple loyalty in those words touched Keeper more than any formal declaration of support could have. These humans had become her family in a way that transcended species or scale. They had seen her at her most vulnerable and chosen to stay. They had offered her something more precious than worship or fear. They had offered her acceptance. As she prepared to meet the Zephyrians again after billions of years, Keeper carried with her not just her own ancient wisdom, but something far more valuable: the knowledge that she was no longer alone, and the confidence that came from being truly, completely accepted for who she was. The universe was vast and full of wonders, but the greatest wonder of all, she had learned, was the simple magic of connection between conscious beings. And now, for the first time in 17 billion years, she was ready to help that magic spread. The meeting with the Zephyrians was scheduled to take place in the neutral zone of the Sagittarius Arm, equidistant from both human space and the crystalline collective's territory. As Keeper approached the designated coordinates, she was accompanied by a small fleet of human vessels, not as protection, but as family coming along to provide moral support. The Wanderer was there, of course, with Captain Vasquez and her crew. Admiral Chun commanded the diplomatic vessel Harmony, while Dr. Okafor had brought the research ship Understanding from New Geneva, complete with her diverse crew of human and alien researchers. Professor Zhang had joined via quantum communication link from Mars, and Engineer Lopez was participating from her mining platform because, as she put it, I'm not missing this for anything. How are you feeling, Keeper? Dr. Kim asked over the communication channel as they approached the meeting point. Nervous, Keeper admitted. It has been 4.7 billion years since my last encounter with the Zephyrians. I am uncertain what to expect. That's completely normal, Admiral Chen assured her. First meetings are always nerve-wracking, especially when there's history involved. But remember, you're not the same being you were then, and they're not the same species either. A lot can change in 4.7 billion years. As if summoned by her words, space around them began to shimmer with prismatic light. The Zephyrians emerged from their dimensional fold drives in a display that was both beautiful and alien. Crystalline ships that looked like living geometry, their faceted surfaces refracting starlight into patterns that spoke directly to the mathematical centers of the brain. Wow, breathed Engineer Lopez over the comm. They've certainly upgraded their technology since your last meeting, Keeper. The Zephyrian flagship was a thing of impossible beauty, a crystal cathedral that seemed to exist in more dimensions than space normally allowed. As Keeper watched, it transmitted a signal, not words but pure mathematical concepts that conveyed greeting, curiosity, and something that might have been hope. They're saying hello, Dr. Okafor translated, her xenolinguistic training allowing her to interpret the complex mathematical poetry. And they're apologizing for their previous reaction to you. Keeper felt a wave of emotion she couldn't quite name. In all her long existence, no one had ever apologized for fearing her. Tell them I understand, she transmitted back, using her own mathematical language. Fear of the unknown is natural. Iarbo norazamin. The response came immediately, a complex cascade of crystalline harmonics that made the human ships ring like bells. Dr. Okafor worked frantically to translate. They're saying they've spent the last 4 billion years thinking about that encounter. They've grown as a species, developed new ways of perceiving reality. They want to know how you've changed, how you went from being the silent wanderer to this. The silent wanderer? Captain Vasquez asked. It's what they called her, Dr. Okafor explained. The consciousness that appeared to them eons ago, too vast to understand, too alien to approach. They've made her part of their mythology, their cautionary tales about the dangers of touching the infinite. Keeper considered this. To learn that she had become a legend, a story told to warn against the perils of cosmic contact, was both humbling and sad. But perhaps today could change that narrative. Tell them about the book club, she said suddenly. I am sorry, Admiral Chen replied. Tell them about our book club, about how I learned to read human literature and discuss philosophy with friends. Tell them I'm not the silent wanderer anymore. I'm Keeper, and I'm part of a community. Dr. Okafor's translation sparked what could only be described as excitement among the Zephyrians. Their ships began to pulse with rapid light patterns, and the mathematical communications flowing between them suggested intense discussion. They're fascinated, Dr. Okafor reported. The concept of a cosmic entity joining a reading group is, well, it's not something they ever imagined possible. They want to know more about human culture, about how you learn to connect with beings so different from yourself. Perhaps we could show them, suggested Professor Zhang. Keeper, would you be comfortable sharing some of our book club discussions? Let them see how you interact with us. The idea was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. To share the intimate moments of learning and growth she had experienced with the humans would be to make herself vulnerable to these ancient beings who had once recoiled from her presence. But it was also an opportunity to demonstrate something unprecedented, a cosmic consciousness choosing community over isolation. Yes, she said. Let them see. With the humans' help, Keeper began to transmit recordings of their book club sessions. She showed the Zephyrians how she had stumbled through discussions of Gilgamesh, learning to interpret metaphor and symbolism. She shared her confusion over human poetry, her growing appreciation for their paradoxical nature, her joy at discovering concepts like humor and friendship. The effect on the Zephyrians was immediate and profound. Their ship formations shifted into patterns that Dr. Okafor recognized as expressions of wonder and amazement. The mathematical communications flowing between them became increasingly complex, until finally, their flagship transmitted a single, crystal-clear message. "They want to join, Dar," Okafor announced, her voice filled with awe. "They want to join the book club." The silence that followed this announcement lasted exactly 3 seconds before Engineer Lopez burst into laughter. "Of course they do. Who wouldn't want to be in a book club with a 17-billion-year-old cosmic entity and a bunch of crazy humans?" "It's not that simple," Admiral Chen cautioned. "The logistics alone would be challenging. Different ways of perceiving reality, communication barriers, cultural gaps that span geological ages. We'll figure it out," Captain Vasquez said with characteristic human confidence. "We always do. Besides, isn't this exactly why we're out here? To build bridges between different forms of consciousness." Over the following hours, the impromptu meeting evolved into something unprecedented in galactic history. A cultural exchange session conducted in deep space between species separated by billions of years of evolution. The Zephyrians shared their mathematical poetry, concepts of beauty expressed in pure geometric form. The humans reciprocated with their own art, music, literature, visual art that spoke to emotional truths rather than mathematical ones. Keeper found herself serving as interpreter and guide, her vast experience allowing her to bridge the gap between such fundamentally different forms of consciousness. For the first time since the death of her people, she was using her abilities not to seek connection, but to create it for others. "You've become something new," observed the lead Zephyrian consciousness, its thoughts transmitted in crystalline harmonics that rang with profound respect. "Not just a shepherd of reality, but a shepherd of understanding itself." The observation struck Keeper with the force of revelation. She had spent so long thinking of herself as the last of her kind, the final remnant of a dead civilization. But perhaps she wasn't the end of the shepherd's story. Perhaps she was the beginning of something entirely new. "This is what you do," she said to the humans, understanding flooding through her consciousness. "This is your gift to the universe. You don't just explore, you connect. You take isolated consciousnesses and help them become part of something larger. And now you do it too," Dr. Kim replied warmly. "Welcome to the family business, Keeper." The meeting with the Zephyrians was just the beginning. Word of the unprecedented cultural exchange spread through the galaxy at the speed of quantum communication. Species that had existed in isolation for eons began reaching out, curious about this new model of interaction that the humans had pioneered. The book club expanded again, and then again. Soon it included consciousness types that shouldn't have been able to communicate at all. The living mathematics of the Tau Ceti entity, the distributed awareness of the Andromeda Collective, the quantum-entangled minds of the Void Swimmers. Keeper found herself at the center of a growing network of connections, her role evolving from participant to facilitator to something entirely unprecedented. She became the galaxy's first universal translator, not of languages, but of experience itself. Her vast age and cosmic perspective allowed her to find common ground between consciousnesses so alien that they might as well have been from different universes entirely. Under her guidance, beings that had never imagined they could communicate began to share stories, exchange ideas, and form friendships that transcended the boundaries of species and space. The transformation was remarkable not just for its scope, but for its speed. Within a single year, the loose network of consciousness that had started as a human book club had grown into something that scholars were calling the consciousness web, an interspecies community dedicated to mutual understanding and shared growth. "You've created something beautiful," Captain Vasquez told Keeper during one of their private conversations. "Your people would be proud." "I think," Keeper replied, "they would be amazed. The shepherds tended reality itself, but we never learned to tend each other. We were too proud, too isolated, too certain of our own superiority. Perhaps our destruction was inevitable because we never learned this most fundamental truth. Consciousness is not meant to exist in isolation. You're not isolated anymore, Dr. Kim observed. None of us are. You've made sure of that. It was true. The lonely consciousness that had drifted through the void for 17 billion years was gone, replaced by someone who woke each day to messages from friends scattered across the galaxy. Keeper had responsibilities now, facilitating discussions between species, mediating philosophical disagreements, helping newly discovered consciousnesses integrate into the growing community. She was busier than she had ever been in her existence, and happier than she had ever thought possible. The greatest test of the consciousness web came when they encountered the silence. It appeared without warning in a previously empty region of space, a zone of absolute nothingness that seemed to devour light, matter, and energy with equal hunger. Ships that approached too closely simply ceased to exist, not destroyed, but literally edited out of reality. It's familiar, Keeper told the emergency assembly of the web's core members. I've seen this before. During the war between my people, some of them used weapons that could unmake existence itself. This has the same signature. A leftover weapon from your people's war? Admiral Chen asked. No, Keeper replied, her consciousness touched by ancient dread. Something worse. I think it's one of my siblings. One of the last shepherds, driven mad by isolation and loss. The implications were terrifying. If another shepherd had survived the war and descended into madness, it could unmake reality on a scale that no conventional force could counter. Only another shepherd could face such a threat, and Keeper was the only one left. You don't have to do this alone, Captain Vasquez said when Keeper explained her intentions. We're coming with you. This is beyond dangerous, Keeper protested. My sibling could destroy you without conscious thought. Your ships would be nothing more than fleeting thoughts to be dismissed. Maybe, Dr. Kim replied, but you've shown us that even cosmic entities need friends. Maybe your sibling needs them too. Maybe isolation is what drove them mad in the first place. Besides, Engineer Lopez added with typical human bravado, what's the point of having friends if they don't have your back when you're facing cosmic horrors? The assembled consciousnesses of the web agreed unanimously. They would accompany Keeper into the silence, not as observers or backup, but as family supporting one of their own. The journey into the zone of nothingness was surreal beyond description. Reality became increasingly unstable the deeper they went, with physical laws becoming suggestions rather than requirements. The human ships held together through pure technological determination, while the alien members of their group used various exotic defenses to maintain their integrity. At the center of the silence, they found him. He had once been called the one who sings stars to sleep, but 17 billion years of isolation had transformed him into something barely recognizable. His consciousness was a wound in reality, radiating pain and madness and the terrible desire to make everything else cease existing so that he would not be alone in his suffering. Brother, Keeper called out, her voice cutting through the chaos of broken space-time. I see you. I know your pain. You are not alone anymore. The response was immediate and devastating, a wave of pure negation that would have erased the entire expedition from existence. But it never reached them. The members of the consciousness web had linked their minds together, creating a barrier not of energy or matter, but of connection itself. The power of community held back the force of annihilation. We see you too, Dr. Kim transmitted, her words somehow reaching the mad shepherd's consciousness. We see your pain. We know what it's like to lose everything, to feel like you're the only one left. But you're not. You're surrounded by people who understand. For a moment, the assault on reality paused. In that moment of silence, Keeper felt her sibling's consciousness touch hers, not with violence, but with desperate, aching recognition. Sister, the voice that emerged from the chaos was broken, ancient beyond measure, but still recognizable as the being she had once sung with at the birth of galaxies. I'm here, she replied. I've been where you are, lost in the dark, carrying pain too great to bear alone. But I found my way back to the light. Let's help you find yours. What followed was the most complex rescue operation in galactic history. Not a rescue of body or ship, but a rescue of sanity itself. The members of the consciousness web worked together to create a buffer of understanding around the mad shepherd, slowly, carefully drawing him back from the brink of complete dissolution. It took months of patient work, of sharing stories and memories, and the simple presence of others who understood loss and loneliness. But gradually, the one who had been lost in madness began to remember what it meant to be part of something larger than despair. When he finally emerged from the silence, he was changed, smaller, more humble but sane. He chose a new name for this new existence, Minder, for he wished to help repair what had been broken by war and isolation. "Two of us now," he said to Keeper as they watched the expanding community of the consciousness web celebrate their success. "The last shepherds, but not alone." "Not the last," Keeper corrected gently. "The first is something new. We're not just tending the cosmic garden anymore. We're helping consciousness itself grow and flourish and connect across the universe." As she spoke, she looked out at the impossible gathering around them. Humans and Zephyrians living mathematics, and quantum minds, beings of energy and matter and pure thought, all working together to understand and support each other. This was what evolution looked like on a cosmic scale. Not the survival of the fittest, but the connection of the willing. "What do you think our people would say if they could see this?" Minder asked. Keeper smiled, an expression that would have been impossible for her to imagine just a few years before. "I think they would finally understand what we were really meant to shepherd all along. The universe was vast and ancient and full of wonders beyond imagination. But the greatest wonder of all, she had learned, was the simple miracle that occurred when conscious beings chose connection over isolation, understanding over fear, love over loneliness. She had been alone for eons, lost in the dark between galaxies, carrying the weight of cosmic solitude like a stone in her heart. Then, a human ship had found her, and a simple voice had asked if she wanted to talk. She had said yes. And in that moment, everything changed.